Hello, and a very warm welcome back to Widowed AF. I'm your host, I'm Rosie Moss. I'm always here, and my job is to kind of facilitate the sharing of stories. What we want to do is create a sense of community, remind you that there is a little bit of hope out there, because particularly if you're listening in the very early stages, it's bleak, right? It's bleak. So today's guest is joining me all the way from Northern Colorado. I have got Rachel Powell. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Rosie. I'm so glad to be here with you and your people today.
I don't think I took a breath in that intro, Rachel. I'm like, breathe, woman, breathe.
That's amazing.
I know. So I just said to Rachel, we just had the Easter break, so this will be going out in a few weeks' time, so this won't make any sort of this sense, but I've not been behind the mic for about 4 weeks, so I don't know what my name is, I don't know what we're doing, so we're just winging it today. We're winging it. I jest, of course. Now, Rachel is obviously here because her husband died, and much like with all my other guests, I tend to not know very much until right before. And I opened up my emails and I went into Rachel's application, and I was sitting outside my daughter's dance class, just, doing a little bit last minute prep. And I just went, oh my God. So listeners, you have got quite the story today. And I'm not going to hog her limelight anymore. I'm going to ask Rachel to tell you herself. You're going to be talking about your husband, Andre, and the little I know is that he took his own life. So obviously this is going to be quite a challenging listen, so do approach it with caution. But Rachel, welcome to the show. And in your own words, tell me how you got here.
Yeah, thanks, Rosie. It's been quite the journey. So I was widowed at 31. My husband, Andre, was only 30 years old when he died by suicide.
Gosh.
And our life really spiraled down the last year of his life. He really had some struggles that were never formally diagnosed, but over the course of a year, he declined, struggling with an addiction that began to get out of control. He began to be abusive in ways in our marriage, and part of my story and the dynamic there was also spiritual abuse from the church when I was crying out for help, being told to stay and submit, and that boundaries were wrong. And so that entire year was really crazy making and very difficult, and got even more so when we lost him suddenly by suicide, and I was left with the 4 kids in 2019.
In your application, sorry, I talked over then because I'm so eager. Because in your application, you put that he died from suicide after a year's decline. And I'd actually written down the word declining to ask you about that. And obviously, you've said there that I guess this decline was primarily caused by some underlying mental health conditions and an addiction.
Yes, it's extremely difficult, right? Because we don't have answers. Mm-hmm. And as a lot of us widows know, we try to look back in hindsight and understand what happened and how did I get here and what could I have done differently. Suicide guilt in particular has a lot of other layers with that. I know that we were in counseling together and separately. I was trying to get us as much help as I could, of what he was willing, staying connected in with our church and with people. But yeah, as I mentioned, I truly believe that he was undiagnosed depression, because in men, it ends up presenting a lot as anger. It can for them. And that was really the case with us. So an addiction struggle that he had in the past, we had had years of sobriety.
Can I ask you what he was addicted to? I feel like I'm being a bit voyeuristic, but
no, it's actually, I'm very open with my story because my whole life has taken a shift to being hope and light to other people. So I'm very willing to talk about
that's really brave of you and very generous of you as well.
Yeah, and I know that my husband, who he was in the spirit, my faith is very important to me, and who he was before all of this happened and who he is now is really a cheerleader for me to help other people. So I believe that I have his support even in sharing in these hard things about the last year of his life. He had a struggle with pornography, but at the end, escalated into a full-blown sex addiction in ways. And so as I was navigating how to handle that and draw boundaries and coming to the point where I believed that I no longer could or had to keep doing life the same way, of just taking hits to my heart and my soul and going on like nothing ever happened. We were married for 11 and a half years to the day. That addiction came up at different times, but really, as I mentioned, escalated. And so when that began to take over, I know he also felt very out of control, and the things that he had, the status, our leadership in church and in other things, just the stability of our family and our marriage as things began to crumble. He came to a very hopeless place, but he was very angry and trying to hold it all together instead of really looking at and addressing the underlying problem that was going on. And it just was not him. He was never like that. And that's what I mean by he became a very different person, very angry and accusatory and blaming instead of honest and humble and repentant and teachable like he had always been.
I'm hearing as well possibly quite a lot of shame, particularly if there's an involvement in the church. Then an addiction to something like pornography and then sex is not something that is going to be, I'm guessing, something that you can comfortably talk about within that community.
I think it's depends on the community. There were and are support groups for men, but in the particular church background that I come from, oftentimes as I lived out, it's, they have a struggle and you need to give grace, and they have accountability groups, but they can really, even in his own words, become places where they can hide, where there isn't real change, and where the expectation is really put on the spouse to endure a repeated cycle rather
Sort of
than
shut up and put up.
Yeah, rather than seeing how abusive that can actually be to the other person who is not allowed to have boundaries, who is not allowed to say no, who is not allowed to make choices for their own well-being. And so I had really come to a place myself of being suicidal, to be frank. I remember sitting with the pastor and him and sharing that I just can't keep doing the same thing in life, where I also, where I want to not be alive anymore. But that was never heard. It was like, I was told that I was extreme. I was told that I was overreactive. But what is the problem is not that people come to a point of passing their limits, but that you expect them to be in a place with no limits for so long that people finally come to breaking point, and then they get blamed and accused that they're the problem. And so a big piece of my journey was connecting with my own counselor, who was just my lifeline in going through this. She was the one person who believed in me, who empowered me, who reiterated health and safety and boundaries despite what was happening with my husband, what's happening with the pastors, and helped me find the strength to believe that I could hear the Lord's voice as a woman, as a wife for myself, and follow that and honor boundaries.
So that you were,
what everyone
because you
was
were
saying.
a woman and a wife, you were still able to interpret, in however way you view this, the idea that you were able to put boundaries in place and that you were worthy. Because what I'm hearing now is that you were absolutely silenced, that all of this chaos is going on around you, and the expectation is that you will just tolerate it. Now, I'm going to ask you, and again, you don't have to answer this, but I don't know very much about sex addiction. I mean, I can hazard a guess, right? But how does it present? Are you comfortable talking about that?
I am comfortable speaking to the topic. The fact is that it can look a lot of different ways,
Yeah, of course,
to different people. So I've been involved in a lot of women's betrayal groups for wives, books. I'm very into self-help learning growth, and that's been part of my journey all through my life, and also how that has connected with men's struggles in this area with their wiring, with what that can look like, whether the groups were partnered, husband and wife, or whether we had separate things going on. Sex addiction itself um, can escalate into a lot of things, but oftentimes pornography begins in certain areas, and even within pornography alone, in your own brain, and to get the same kind of dopamine hit, you have to do things that are
More
more
and more
extreme
extreme.
and view more extreme things, and there can become this point where just viewing things is not enough, and where acting on them in other ways is where that can escalate to, and that can be virtual connections with people through the computer, through the phone, or in person, things that people do to act out and where they begin to wander. What I will say is some of the things that were starting to go on, he could have been arrested for, and that was another very difficult piece in trying to understand the response of leadership and his family, and even navigating things in widowhood, because people don't still believe me, or understand, they know this incredible person who he very much was. And in that last year of his life, the people who saw this decline the most were myself, our pastor, and perhaps our marriage counselor. He really delighted in our kids and loved them. He was such a fun father. I mean, even up to the week before he passed away, a family member, I remember hearing them say after he died, there's no way he had, depression or this problem. He was just here. He was laughing and everything was fine. And they don't understand what was happening behind closed doors, or his anger or the addiction, because he was not that person. And so that can be a very difficult part of a spouse navigating someone with an addiction, because everybody doesn't see from the outside what that really entails. And so as I tried to navigate, how do I have boundaries, and how do I get us help, and what does this look like? In my mind, the worst case scenario for me was, if he continues to defend this and refuse to get help, maybe this is going to turn into a separation or even divorce. But I never in a million years thought we would lose him by suicide. That was just like the most unbelievable thing. And he was really in a desperate place. And that speaks as well to what you mentioned about the church. Those dynamics, even though it seems like, well, they're hearing the men and wanting to support the men and wanting to get, their wives to yield or whatever, it sets our men up for failure as well, because he had so much pressure to perform. And he definitely, both of us had been very high performers in life. We're the honor student, you're the valedictorian, and I was, all of these things. But when you come to the place where you're the most broken, and your roles in the church, or how you're allowed to serve or lead, or all these things start to fall away and get taken from you, and you're viewed differently because of how messy in this particular church.
Can I ask what the church is?
It was more of a non-denominational Christian church. But even within that, it's important for me to name the difference between this church I had been to and what I found in the aftermath was the same on paper type of church, but is a completely different community in how safe it is, and in how people are treated and viewed.
Hearing you say that the women needed to yield, like that word, when you said that, that's a real word. It sounds almost like going back in time, where the women are very much sort of second-class citizens, and I suppose it's almost unfathomable as an outsider to imagine this for you, and what that must have been like.
Yes, I think women who find themselves in that place, as I was, when your faith has been important and you've grown up in a community, or you've come into a community, what I found, because my husband now and other people in my life now have asked me, but how could you have tolerated that? Or like, why didn't you change churches sooner? Or like, do something, like, how could you have endured that? And as I've really processed that question and worked with and helped so many other women as well. You really, it's like, I think of it like a quilt where you have been stitched in for so long, under the teachings and indoctrinated, where spiritual abuse happens, where your faith, where your relationship with God, your desire to be honoring and good and is twisted and used against you,
Mhm.
because those things become, it becomes a moral issue of right and wrong. And when you have learned things that you truly believe, people are interpreting scripture correctly, and you're wanting to live your life in a different and radical way for the Lord and for good things, those places where people are manipulated and where abuse is allowed to happen and all of these things that are twisted and wrong are still, you're still stitched into,
Mm.
this is the person in authority, I'm supposed to honor them, I'm supposed to, follow my husband and support him in ways, and they take good things and they twist them into things that are blaming victims and shaming and abusive. And it's from living under that space and not ever having a problem with it until there's a problem that becomes really hard to navigate how to get out. And so that's a very challenging thing that women find
Mm.
about beginning to find their voice. And that was why my faith in the Lord, it was such an empowering thing to me, that it wasn't that I was being off the rails and disobedient and all of these things. I was finding true grounding in the Lord, who never wanted those things for me as his daughter. He gave me my voice and he invites me to speak. And his empowerment in me changes everything. It's not that I'm grasping and taking things or I'm fighting wars with people. This is really about how the Lord loves me fundamentally, is a rock that I stand on that helps me withstand abuse from other people.
So Andre he's got this addiction. It's escalated. You're very, very isolated. And that is a familiar story of everybody I've spoken to who has lost somebody to addiction, because
Mhm.
they more often than not, will portray a normal, charismatic, happy-go-lucky persona to the outside world. And that makes this particular grief really, really isolating. And I'm thinking now, okay, so it's escalating. You also said to me you have 4 children. So one is biologically yours, and then you adopted your nieces and nephews. Is that right?
That's correct. Well, legally, I have allocation of parental responsibility. That may or may not come into this conversation, but it's a complicated dynamic where I have decision making, but parental rights have not been severed. So there are people in the family that I still have to navigate, dealing with legal rights when we were the ones, and that was a challenge for Andre and I together. Um,
But presumably and I don't like to use the word taken on, it always feels a bit patronising, but you've taken on some children that aren't biologically yours and were raising them as your own, which in itself kind of gives me an idea of the character of you both, because that's a big thing to do, right? And you've said that he was a brilliant dad and, very hands-on. So what happens in this year, what happened in the lead up to his death? And if you don't mind telling me a little bit about the death. I mean, again, it feels so vulgar asking you to do this, but I know that you've said you want to be really open, and it is the details like this that, by details, I don't mean you have to give me details, but this is the stuff that people can't access normally. This is the stuff that we give them. It's the really real truth.
Yeah, I am sure that our kids, and these kids are very intuitive,
Mm-hmm.
knew that there was tension and some things were wrong. But I absolutely have to say, that the children were the jewel of Andre's eye. Like, he loved these children like they were his own as much as I did, and they were my sister's children. So from the very beginning, we were married at 19, and before we were officially married, we were helping raise my niece. She was born when I was 18. So
Good
I've been heavily
19.
involved. Yeah, we were just babies, grew
I'm
up
sad I could
together, but
barely
grew
tie
up
my own shoelaces at 19.
with with these kids. You know, we had to grow up pretty fast.
How old then were the children at this time?
When he passed away, I believe they were 13, 11, 3, and 1. And so our biological one was 5 days from turning 2. And he just delighted in those kids. And yet we had this dynamic of things escalating. He had graduated with his PhD. He was starting his own
Smart
business
chap.
that he had dreamed of. He was brilliant and talented, and yet he had names that everything he'd worked for toward in his life, he was struggling to find purpose and meaning in it. So again, the depression, the hopelessness, there was things that were there, let alone the dynamic of my boundaries. So about a year before he passed away, he had acted out in a way where I was like, you know what, I have to take a break, like a T here. We've navigated this struggle in different ways over the, at that point, 10 or so years we'd been married. And I said, I can't keep doing this the same way, but I need to figure out how I can move forward in a way that's honoring to the Lord and to myself and to you, and how we heal and get help. And so we had about a 5-day separation, and that was excruciating to him. That, for whatever reason, I don't know all of the depths. I think part of that maybe is trauma from his past, or identity issues of feeling disconnected or abandoned or alone, all the way to, like I mentioned, the need in our community to uphold this marriage and family and how things are supposed to look, to be put together, and to have privileges to serve in the church, and these different things. When that started to fall apart, that became a focus of the entire last year, was that I had the separation that he was convinced was wrong and sin. Just the separation, just the 5-day, like, I need to take a break and deal
So
with
that
what
was a
just
sin,
happened.
but not the other stuff.
Right, that was how it began to get twisted, because that wasn't like him. But for whatever reason, that was the fixation on trying to protect himself from that ever happening again. And I needed to admit that that was wrong, and that would never happen again. And that became the fixation, and that became what, again, our pastors came alongside and agreed with. That was wrong. It should never have happened. And some of these places where I was needing to draw boundaries, but that, the threat of that was really something that he felt he couldn't handle. And I found after he passed away that he had written about that in one of his journals, that he did not believe he could survive if we had a long separation. And I don't understand all of the depths of what that meant, but I knew that that was something that everything hinged on. And so as we continued forward in things escalating and me needing to come up with like a safety plan, it was structured through our group so that if there were behaviors and acting out, I wasn't reactive, but had already laid out a thought of plan of what I would need based on what kind of acting out in the addiction we're talking about. But
I've got to just interject here, because this is like it's like victim blaming, right? It's so you've got to have a plan in case he acts out, like, and you're not allowed to be reactive.
yeah, the safety plan was really, it was really for me. That was from my support group, and I created it so that when I was navigating this, it wasn't reactive. Yeah, I mean, yes, in a sense for them, but for me and for my kids, like, we have a plan in place as to what this looks like and what I need to feel safe going forward. But he didn't feel that he could deal with that. And so that was really coming to a head where he was refusing to acknowledge or sit down and talk about or respond to this safety plan. Um, yeah, that was the most devastating thing because as things were getting out of control, um, I had written a letter. I went over with my counselor, with my group, with prayer. I had sought counsel and feedback into this and to not again just be saying things on the fly, but to have thoughtfully put together
Mm-hmm.
something where I read him and that said, I need a reply about this, like about this help I'm trying to put in place because things are blowing up and it can't keep going this way. Um, like we have to be able to look in the face what's happening and you be committed to getting help. Or we're going to have to take a break until you can give me an answer. And Rosie, that was when he walked out. I read him that letter, and that was when he walked out that night at the house. Um, yeah, very impulsive. Um, he said, "What a death blow! What a death blow!" And he left our home. Um, it was about 10 p.m. and I never saw him again. He walked some miles from our home. Was where he passed away in the early hours of the morning. It's believed, just like right early hours of technically the next day. And so the grief that I held, suicide grief already,
Mm.
I've connected with a number of suicide widows, though it's different even within
Yeah.
that realm of if they had, struggles with depression, or even if it was out of the blue, when you have the dynamic of someone who has been abusive, who has been blaming, or who blames you as they and before they do that, or I've known a lot of widow sisters who've had their husbands do it in front of them. It's a completely um, different kind of grief and guilt to navigate because, of course, I immediately just took responsibility that if I hadn't done this and if I hadn't set these boundaries, or if I hadn't read him, why did I read him the letter that night? Even though I had tried to, getting input from people and making sure that this was and prayer and trying, like, I was like, I should have had someone else there. I should have picked a different time of day. I should have, and it's really been a part of people's healing. Part of what I help widows walk through who struggle with that is navigating that guilt piece, because that will keep you stuck.
Mm-hmm.
And coming to the place where I could really see and believe, and it still comes up in little ways where I will have to address it, but that was not my choice. That was not my desire, that I did not make that choice, that I did not do that I was not at fault, and that Andre's brain at that time, clearly over that last year became very sick. And I grieve the pain that he was in. I grieve how he felt he had to try to hold our life together and try to force hold our marriage together, and all of what the different forces were or pains were inside of him, that led us to that point. But that that is not who he was, and a huge help has been knowing now who he is now, knows, you know, the reality, all of the lies and the blame and the shroud and the chains and the confusion are gone. He knows very clearly um, that was a mistake, that was not my doing or my fault, and is completely whole and healed now. And the things that the Lord has given me and that have been massively healing, but that's been a part of the navigating from where I was stuck, hopeless, because I became so hopeless from this experience. And it's really important that people realize when you lose someone to suicide, the rates of suicide and the people around them who loved them
Mm-hmm.
go up. And even more so if you were the spouse or the partner. When you lose someone by suicide, your rates go up even higher. And I struggled intensely with suicide myself after that for years. And I ended up attempting twice
I'm so sorry.
myself, because I was so hopeless, and
Mm-hmm.
in the beginning, so guilty, for what had happened, and the dynamics that continued to happen in the church that I was involved in, which is a different story of how I still continued to be silenced and, having consequences and repercussions for the ways that I was not staying in line that were so grievous to me, where I needed to leave that church and find another place. But you're talking about all of these changes and trying to find the
Yeah.
power to do them in a time where you're completely shattered. So really, through my darkest times and the most hopeless times, and where I felt the most voiceless and the most powerless, became a catalyst to where I found under all the rubble, all the things I didn't want to lose, my husband and my life, and where the future felt so bleak. A bomb goes off and you're sifting through the rubble. Under the
Mm-hmm.
rubble, I still found this foundation of hope that was what I couldn't lose, even if I lost all of these other things. And that has been ground zero for me to rebuild a life that I love and a life that has
Mm.
hope and abundance again. And that's what's so important to me in helping other people to find, because there's so many people struggling with hopelessness, with suicide, who have been impacted by spiritual abuse, these different things that feel like your life is over and feel like there's nothing good ahead, and will never be the same good as when you lose your spouse,
Mm.
but it can be good again, and we need that hope.
Now, normally I would ask people, what support did you have? Did people rally around you? Did you have, in America, they have the meal train, don't they? We don't have that here. We need to get this here.
Oh.
But from what you're telling me, did you have any support? Were people kind to you?
Yes, I did have support, and then there were places where there were things that were massively unhelpful.
Mm.
Which is probably something a lot of us experience. People don't know exactly how to come around you. I would say in tragedy, there's often a big wave of support, right? The wave rises, but it tends to fall away
Hmm.
just about as quickly as it rose. So there was
Generally
a
at the
lot of,
funeral.
yeah, yes, or not too long after. My church at the time, there was a lot of people in it. Um, I believe the leadership desire. I still don't believe my old pastors and leadership had some malicious intent to tear me apart and wound me, or that they still do. Did those things happen? Yes. But, in their attempts to help, there was a lot of things that were done that were absolutely wrong and hurtful. But the people within the church, a lot of them did rally to, like you mentioned, a meal train. There were people who came and brought us meals. There were people who came and helped clean in our home. I mean, I don't know what I would have done without these people, because I was I was a 31-year-old widow with these 4 kids and still navigating the dynamics with my family and the legal situation, which got even more complicated when my husband passed away, because I didn't have my partner there
Hmm.
to support me. And so, in ways, some of my family members felt like they were the ones who were taking my feet out from under me when I needed help the most. And then we went into the COVID pandemic.
Hmm.
Um, so, that was a whole nother thing to navigate, where the world turned inward, everybody trying to figure out how to survive, how them and their job and their family. And we were very broken and floating out there. All of the children, were home from school. I lost my nursing job because I had to be home with them,
Hmm.
to school them. And yeah, lots of challenges. So there were people and there was help, but I was also trying to navigate these things that happened after in the church. And
Within the
um,
church, and forgive me because I'm not religious, so I don't have a great understanding of this, but it's my understanding that suicide is quite frowned upon within religious circles. Is that right? So, um, was there a sort of a tainting to his death?
I would say that really depends on what religion you're talking
Hmm.
about. There are some people who hold the view that suicide is an unforgivable sin, or there's something, that it isn't biblical at all. I didn't experience any of that. However, in the confusion of what had happened, and in my old church's high standard of what the roles and of men and women are, that I was not, I wasn't following what they wanted me to do for a time I had about yielding and submitting. And
Mhm.
I was still navigating this in relationship with them, but drawing boundaries anyway, and then reaching for other outside help, which really should have been referred out, which the church needs to know in here. When things are, well, even before this level, pastors are not equipped to deal with this kind of trauma and struggles and level of addiction, and people need to be referred out for help. And
Mm.
and so in their desire to help and try to be there for both of us, whom they knew really well, we were part of that church for many, many, many years. Over a decade we'd been involved there heavily. So that the dynamics there, where Andre viewed me as unsubmissive and not honoring the Lord or doing what is right, and in their desire to come alongside him and support him, I was left not only unprotected, but also, even after his passing, there continued to be the view and the language that they held that I was not cooperating, yielding, honoring authority. And so, um, after he passed away, I was removed from leading worship. And as I began to question some of these things, they gave other answers like, well, you need to focus on your family right now. Um, and and these different things, which they said later is what they said because they didn't want to hurt my feelings. But I was already to a point where, and everything that had just happened, of telling me they were complicit in abuse by telling me to stay in it, and it was definable
Mhm.
abuse. As I started to have questions about these things and use my voice more, what they considered pushback was not well received. Asking things like, how is it that you can tell me that these people can come and watch my children so I can go and have time at a coffee shop with my Bible, but you're telling me I can't have these same people come and be with my kids for the same amount of time, who want to support me in being there at band practice? Like, what is the difference in the distinctions between where you determine what I need to do? Where do you tell me what to do versus what God calls me to do? And the micromanaging and the control, and really what they were questioning and putting up for question in their own minds, and repeatedly to people that I didn't realize behind the scenes that they were meeting with, is questioning my character. But again, it all was back in these roots of all of this stuff that had happened before, where I was not cooperating in my quote unquote biblical role, where I was finding a voice and drawing boundaries and questioning things. And that did not go over well, both before, but it carried into after. So the ways that it was not helpful after Andre passed away was all of that. And despite, lots of repeated attempts to have meetings and understand, I did not want to be a person who threw up the middle finger and left disgruntled or was bitter or hateful or angry. And in trying to have these meetings and talk about things openly and honestly and involve my counselor, who themselves had said, these men are not listening. She was a woman. They're not listening to my voice as a woman or a professional counselor. And there was just so many red flags that came up, that it really became clear to me that a long time ago I should have left and
Mhm.
needed to go. And so I that was a really scary thing for me, because a lot of the support that I did have came from that place. People who didn't know all the
Yeah.
behind the scenes of what was happening, but that was their community. And so when I left everybody, that was one of the most scary, and what I realize now, brave things I ever did. And again, rooted in my deep knowing that I have the support and love of my Father who wants healing and hope and who empowers me and gives me my voice and is like, even in all these ways, I was like, oh, well, what do I do when you are either explicitly or implicitly told that you need a man for all of these different things? How does that set us up for
Mm.
widowhood? How does that
Yeah.
set us up for these things that happen? Because then what? Then these other people need to step in to tell you what you can and can't do, who are men, where I came to realizing the Lord leads me where I need to go, and I can confidently know that I can hear his voice and he can help me in what is best for me and my family and walk that out. And I did, and I found a community. I found a church that was completely different in that regard, and it was such a healing thing, Rosie, because it would be and could be so easy to just have left the church.
When you say leave the church, again, preaching to the uninitiated choir over here, do you mean that you had to leave your home? Did you move areas? Or do you just, not just, you stop going to the same church? Just for the
I
idiot at the back, explain it.
I ended up moving as well, moving cities. I needed to do that. Like I mentioned, we were not super far distance from where he passed away, and there was just so many triggers, and I realized my home was not a healing place. I needed to make some changes. But before that, yes, it was leaving that church body. And during the pandemic, in fact, when people weren't meeting together or where everybody was wearing masks, and I'm a widow with these 4 kids who are grieving and struggling, and you're trying to keep masks on them, I did that brave journey of visiting different places for months and months and prayerfully, considering where we would be, and where we landed was in a community that was so supportive and so welcoming and so empowering, to women and who believed in me and my family, and that we had value to bring in something to offer, that we didn't need to be micromanaged, where I was so used to someone questioning my motives about everything, and being gaslit about, I don't even know like what I'm supposed to be doing or what boundaries are or what Holy Spirit is saying clearly if it doesn't agree with what they're saying. It was a completely different experience. And so yes, I moved churches, and then I also moved homes and cities as well.
That is brave. And can I ask, out of the 4 children, do you have daughters?
Yes, 3 of the 4 are
3
girls.
of them.
That poor boy.
So I've written down like feminist widow rebellion, okay? Because that's what I'm hearing is that this awful thing happened. It's like your blinkers came off. You looked around, you realized these men do not have my best interests at heart. And you took that decision to leave, to take your children and leave, because presumably you didn't want that for your daughters either. The idea that they would take all of their direction from men, that they would be told to yield, words like this. This is not what we want for our daughters.
Yes, and a huge part of that too was realizing I like to not just pit it as what it can often be of like men against women, as against, because I believe that there is such value in what we both bring and in how we partner together. But I had confidence in the Father leading and empowering me as his daughter. And you're right, it became very important to me, um, that my children had something different, even in the dynamic of the oldest one at that point, was involved still with that youth group where she had had friends and where she had had connections. I didn't want to tear her from relationships or isolate her. So there was some time there, but in as I gained clarity, there was definitely a moment where I realized I think there was going to be a retreat or a youth conference or something like that. And I was like, oh my gosh, why would I send her to hear from these exact same men in the things that they had told me and in what they told me to do and in the experience I had before and after my husband passed away, and to be in a community where she could potentially meet, as she's getting into her teenage years, a boy that she's going to gain relationships with, and people who are under the same this same
And the
community
whole
and the
cycle.
same teaching. And I was like, oh, wow, like that's not at all what I want for her. And so finding a different community and place, and they have their own faith journeys. My oldest, she's now 19. My youngest is now 7, and
Same
everyone's
as
living
mine.
at home with me. And that's her own journey. But for my part, realizing my fear of her not being in a community or having any faith was not going to override the boundaries that I knew of what she needed of being safe and being connected with people in a church that was safe and healthy. And I learned experientially the importance of what that meant. And so, that was very important for them. And then as she got older, as widows, we're trying to help our children if we have them to navigate this grief and the different struggles and with suicide loss and what that means and how do you explain to them in an age appropriate way what happened.
How did you, on that note?
Yeah, I had connected too with a grief specialist who worked with children, and they confirmed my thoughts there. Like right after Andre passed away, I had someone in my family who was like, "Oh, you don't tell them like how he died. Like that's traumatic and that's horrible. You're not going to tell them. Don't tell them how he passed away." And I was like, it's really important from the beginning to be honest, because that is not only going to throw, I felt a whole wrench in their grief journey later to like, what? It was suicide? Like, oh, what, all of a sudden? But the fact that they're probably going to hear it from someone who's not you. They're probably going to find out in a way where you're not the one sharing with them. And so how to do that in an age appropriate way was really important. So even my little ones, and I talked with them about that and was trying to explain. And I told them, your daddy and your uncle daddy. And we had this discussion multiple times when they were little, right? Because their brains, it's all a fog, grief for a lot of us. So it was more than one
the gory
discussion.
details quite a lot, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
That I explained to them that he did something to make his body not be alive anymore. He made a choice to do something where his body wasn't alive anymore. And we periodically had this discussion at different times and in different language then as they got older. But for my oldest and related to these things that had happened and why we had moved churches and why I didn't encourage her. This came up again recently. She's much older and still has a friend that is involved with this group, and they were having her doing something, and she has the discernment. She came and talked with me about this, and as we talked about it more, and she has some
because
wisdom.
You gave her
now.
a voice. You gave her
Right.
the voice that you
and
didn't
she has
have.
some wisdom to know what red flags are and what that means, and to have a community that's really transparent and honest and repentant in your leadership. And so it's come at a cost to me, but I hope and pray that that's a gift that I can give to my children and to the women that I work with and help who are navigating, because in the throes of all of that, it's all chaotic. You're in grief and you're in loss and you're trying to figure out what life decisions you're making, and like you said, that the way of support goes, and what does that look like to find handholds in hope and in a future and in rebuilding it and having any joy about that. It is so important, because it's so easy to roll over and give up or quit or get stuck.
I said to you just before we came on mic, because we were talking about hope and the idea that the people who come onto my podcast, the stories are all different. It might be the same death, it might be the same type of cancer in the same amount of time, but the story is always different. But there's this kind of trajectory, this arc, where they get to rock bottom and they think, I've got a choice now. I can either give in and lie here at the bottom, or I can begin that horrible, exhausting, often with kids on your back, pulling your hair and asking for snacks, climb out. And it's a really brave thing to do. It's really brave. And I do want to ask you a little bit about your work, because you've mentioned a little bit about supporting other widows, and what is it that you do and what led you to do it? Just give me in fact, you can give yourself a little plug. Hey.
Yeah, so I will tell you where Hope Speaker started. It has a name now. Hope Speaker started when I was at the place of my husband's death in the early hours of the morning. I, for a long time, I would go there and grieve very intensely.
Hmm.
And it became, as I mentioned in my own struggles with suicide, it became a dangerous place for
I
me
guess,
also.
yeah.
And I had done what he did, which was to walk barefoot from our home to the couple of miles to where he had passed away. And it was about 3 in the morning, and I was laying on the rocks um, at that place. And I had no hope. I wasn't thinking forward, future. I was really in a place of, I'm in so much pain. I feel like I can't do this anymore. And so I know that this didn't come from me and my mind. But as I was laying there, I had this vision from the Lord, and I was standing on this stage, and I don't know how to describe it in words, but I was so clearly speaking hope. I was speaking hope. And as I was laying there and I looked out, uh, everyone in this audience, they were all laying there in their own space similar to where I was. They were all in their own space of hopelessness. And the Lord told me, He said, you have to keep going. You have to keep living. You have to show them how. And it didn't save me from all of my struggles. I still ended up attempting another time and had struggles, but that night it got me up off of the rocks and I walked home. And it was years of that grueling struggle. I come from a place of the lived experience of not just, the RN behind my name or the things that, but having been where people are and have lived through and gotten to where they want to
Hmm.
go, which is this abundant hope. And so, Hope Speaker, I ended up leaving nursing to start my own business, and I am a coach and I'm a speaker and a writer, and I reach people for hope. And I primarily work with widows and people impacted by suicide, whether that's loss or personal struggle, and spiritual abuse, because those are deep parts of my story that led to hopelessness. And hopelessness kills people, and hopelessness keeps people stuck,
Hmm.
just going through their days until they're done and not being in a place to dream or rebuild. And so the work that I love to do is to help people through getting unstuck and coming from a place where they feel so lonely and helpless to being in a place where they can take confident steps to rebuild a life that they love or love again. And and the empowerment piece there that we can have to do it. We can do it. And so that's what I love to do.
Yeah, and you're so right. I can remember saying to my mum, I've accepted Ben's died, I've accepted it, but I've also accepted that I'm just going to exist. That I'm just going to get through till the kids are old enough, and then I'll probably just drown myself in vodka or something. Because I couldn't see in the grips of that enormous, all-consuming grief, I couldn't see that there would be any hope, any joy, any glimmers of a life beyond this. And of course, I have got a life around it. It's not perfect, whose is, but I have built a life around it. And there is joy and there is excitement and there is laughter in my life. And I think, you talk about that moment on the rock, and, I've had similar moments myself. There's been times, and, ultimately led me to go to the doctors and get some help. But
Mhm.
you could become a tragic statistic, or you could help people by showing them that they don't have to become a tragic statistic. And it takes enormous courage. And I say it sound like I'm blowing my own trumpet, but I know, because I've done it. I know, because it's tough and it's hard. And then to use your enormous pain and tragedy to try and make the world a bit better for other people, I think that's a kind of a gift that we've got, and if you in it, but it's what you choose to do with it. And
Mm.
so all credit to you for doing this, because your story is not an easy one. It's a, that you've had a tough time, and you're still pretty young as well, right? So just if people want to find you, do they Google Hope Speaker? Have you got Instagram, things like that?
Yeah, they can find Hope Speaker. They can find me on Facebook and Instagram. The website is hopespeaker.com. And I have resources. I have a newly widowed checklist and a message of hope and other things I pour into just a free library where I can connect with people and where I can send them hope weekly as well. And that's hopespeaker.com/library. And all of those resources they can opt in for free. And then for people who are interested, who are feeling like they have been stuck in that place, but they're ready to take steps to have some kind of tangible plan and support. For someone, like you mentioned, when you can't find it, you can't perceive hope, and you can't find it or believe it for yourself, to have me come alongside to believe for them and to help them through that, they can email connect@hopespeaker.com about setting up a coaching consult, and I would be happy to connect with them and walk alongside them.
One of my lovely guests, Laurie, she referred to this as being a grief Sherpa. So you guide others through the kind of rough terrain. Well, Rachel, I want to say it's been lovely talking. It has, but my God, I think I need like a little sit down in a dark room.
It's heavy stuff, but that's the hope that we have, is through the darkest, like I said, the darkest, heaviest thing. I'm pretty raw and real. And so calling things what they are and facing death and loss and the finiteness of it, that to me though is where we find that, because death, which all of us face,
It's barely
and the
inevitable, right?
loss of things along the way, we're all going to have that siphoned from us, but that's where we find that kind of hope. For me, the resurrection and the life, there's something foundational underneath that offers a richer meaning and purpose in life. And so it's never, all is never lost.
No, and I took a picture once. I was in London and there was a sign, and it was a bit of street art, and it said everything is lost. And I can remember taking a picture of it because that's how I felt. And everything isn't lost. It's a terrible, terrible thing, but we are still here. Rachel, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been really, really fascinating to talk to you. And I imagine that there will be a lot of listeners who perhaps can relate to, if not all, then certainly parts of your story, because those threads of living with an addict and, the isolation and the shame, that will be something that a lot of people can relate to. And I've never really spoken to anybody from a church background. So to have that little bit of insight into your world was really amazing. I wish you much hope and healing in your journey as you continue. And I hope you and the kids, continue to grow and thrive in this new life that you're creating for them.
Yes, thank you. We are. We're just soaking in the richness of the days that we have, one day at a time. Glad to be here and connect with you.
Thank you so much. And for any of my listeners that have got any questions, if it has raised some stuff for you, you can reach me at the Widowed AF Instagram or by the website. And if you've got any questions for Rachel, if you didn't quite catch the email address or anything like that, it will be in the show notes, and I can also forward any messages to her. But for now, it is goodbye from me, goodbye from Rachel. I will be back with you very soon with another story from the forefront of widowhood. Lots of love. Goodbye for now. Thank you for listening. If you found this episode helpful, hit follow or subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you think someone else may benefit from this, please do share. We'd also really appreciate a quick review. It helps more people find the show. Thank you again, and see you next time on Widowed AF.